Think about this for a moment. Every intimate detail published about Prince William and Prince Harry during their most vulnerable years, their arguments, their relationships, their private conversations, their most personal and painful crises, potentially reached those newspaper pages through one method: a private investigator, a corrupted voicemail system, a crime. Not journalism, not sources, not the careful, legitimate gathering of information that a free press is supposed to represent. A crime. Committed systematically, over the years, against members of the royal family, against celebrities, against ordinary people who happen to be adjacent to fame, against anyone whose private life was deemed commercially valuable enough to steal. In 2023, a British High Court judge ruled that Mirror Group newspapers had unlawfully intercepted the voicemails of Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex. Harry became the first senior royal in over a century to give evidence in a British court. And he won. He sat in that courtroom, under oath, and he told the truth about what had been done to him. And a judge, a senior British judge, in the very heart of the legal establishment that this country trusts to protect its citizens, agreed with him. But here is what that verdict opened. Far beyond the question of Harry's damages award, far beyond the headlines about newspaper editors and private investigators, it opened the question that the British establishment has spent 15 years trying to keep permanently, firmly, hermetically closed. How far up did the knowledge go? Not just inside the newsrooms, not just inside the editorial offices where decisions were made about which stolen voicemails were worth publishing. Inside the palace. Because if royal phones were being hacked for years, if the private conversations of the future King of England were being systematically intercepted, then somewhere, someone inside the institution that is supposed to protect the royal family had to have known, or should have known. And the question of what they did with that knowledge, or chose not to do, is the question that the legal proceedings of 2023 and 2024 are now forcing, slowly, painfully, into the open. Tonight, we follow the evidence, all the way to the top. And before we go any further, if this is the kind of forensic, unfiltered storytelling you've been looking for, do me a favor right now. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, because what we do here is go where the mainstream commentary won't, every single week. And you are going to want to be here for what's coming. Now, let's build this properly. Because to understand why the 2023 and 2024 hacking verdicts are so historically significant, you need to understand what the British establishment believed had been settled over a decade ago. You need to understand the official story, the managed narrative, the version of events that the powerful people in this country agreed upon and then presented to the public as the complete and final truth. In 2011, the phone hacking scandal exploded into public consciousness when it emerged that the News of the World, Rupert Murdoch's now defunct British tabloid, had hacked the voicemail of a murdered schoolgirl named Millie Dowler. A child. A dead child. The public revulsion was immediate, total, and entirely justified. The paper closed within days of the story breaking. A full public inquiry into the Leveson inquiry was launched under a senior judge. The political class responded with outrage. Hearings were held, editors were questioned, prime ministers were called to account for their relationships with newspaper proprietors. The press responded, publicly, with contrition. Prosecutions followed, convictions followed. People went to prison. And then, in the way the British establishment has perfected over centuries of managing its own failures, the crisis was contained. Declared resolved. A line was drawn in the sand, and everyone with power in this country agreed, either explicitly or through the quiet machinery of institutional consensus, that the line would not be crossed again. Senior figures in the press industry, in the political world, and this is the part that matters most for what we're discussing tonight, in the palace machinery, all operated from a shared assumption after Leveson. The assumption was simple. This is over. The guilty parties have been identified. The industry has reformed. We have held our inquiry, we have expressed our regret, we have made our promises, and now we move on. Nothing more to see here, nothing more to examine. The story is finished. Harry's lawsuit blew that assumption apart. Not metaphorically, structurally. Like a controlled demolition of a building that everyone had been told was perfectly sound. Because Harry's legal team in the Mirror Group case and in the subsequent proceedings against News Group newspapers produced evidence suggesting that phone hacking was not an isolated rogue operation confined to one newsroom in one particularly lawless corner of Fleet Street. It was a systemic, industry-wide practice. It ran across multiple publications simultaneously. It lasted for years. It victimized hundreds, possibly thousands of people. And the number of victims, royal, celebrity, and ordinary, was vastly, catastrophically larger than the official narrative of the original scandal had ever acknowledged. This was not a minor revision to the established story. This was not a footnote, not a correction, not an addendum. This was a fundamental challenge to the version of events that the British press, the British government, and the British establishment had spent over a decade insisting was the complete and definitive truth. And Harry, a man the establishment had every reason and every motivation to dismiss as a disgruntled ex-royal, nursing personal grievances and seeking American celebrity relevance, was the one forcing that challenge through the courts, through the legal system, on the record, under oath, with evidence. Which is precisely why the establishment's response to his legal campaign was so visceral, so sustained, and so breathtakingly personal. You watched it happen in real time. You saw the newspaper columns. You heard the commentary. You witnessed the sustained, coordinated effort to characterize Harry's pursuit of legal accountability as vanity, as grievance, as the petulant behavior of a man who had abandoned his country and was now attacking it from the comfort of California. The establishment didn't argue with the evidence. It couldn't argue with the evidence. It attacked the man bringing it. Because he wasn't just suing newspapers. He was calling the entire post-Leveson settlement a lie, and they knew it. And that terrified them. Now let's come to January 2024, because this is where the story moves from historically significant to genuinely explosive. News Group newspapers, the publisher of The Sun and formerly of the now-closed News of the World, makes an announcement that just 5 years earlier would have been considered not merely unlikely, but constitutionally, commercially, institutionally impossible. They settle Harry's lawsuit. With an apology. Not a standard legal settlement with no admission of liability, the formula that British institutions have deployed for decades to pay out claims without ever having to acknowledge, on the record, that they did anything wrong. An actual apology. A statement in which News Group newspapers acknowledged, in writing, that Harry had been subjected to phone hacking and unlawful activities by private investigators working for its titles. A statement that described what had been done to him as, and I want you to hear these words carefully, seriously unlawful. A statement that expressed what it called profound regret. Rupert Murdoch's British newspaper empire. The institution that had defined British tabloid culture for half a century. The operation that had made and broken prime ministers. The organisation that had maintained a relationship with the palace, a relationship of mutual benefit and carefully managed access for decades. That institution said sorry. To a prince. To a prince it had spent years depicted as unstable, ungrateful, self-pitying, and dangerous to the institution he had left behind. The significance of that moment cannot be overstated, and I want to make sure we don't let it slide past us in the rush of news cycles and royal commentary. Because the apology was not just about Harry. It was not a personal concession made to a man with the resources and the determination to fight a long legal battle. It was about the systemic nature of what had been done. About the years of stories, intimate stories, invasive stories, humiliating stories, stories about the most private dimensions of royal life that had been built on stolen, criminally obtained private information. It was an acknowledgement that the content those newspapers had published about the royal family was not the product of journalism. It was the product of crime. And the question that acknowledgement immediately raised in legal circles, in political circles, in the private conversations of people who operate inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, was the one that nobody in a position of power wanted to stand up and answer. If Harry was being hacked, if his private conversations were being systematically intercepted over years, what about William? William has not filed a lawsuit. William has maintained a careful, deliberate, studied distance from the entire legal campaign that his brother pursued through the British courts. His public statements on the subject have been minimal, to the point of extraordinary ambiguity for a man in his position. He has said, broadly, that he supports the principle of press accountability. He has not said what he knows. He has not said what he suspects. And the palace has been meticulous in ensuring that his precise position on the evidence produced in Harry's cases remains carefully unclear. But sources close to the palace's legal machinery, and these are not tabloid whispers, these are the considered assessments of people with direct knowledge of how the palace's legal operation functions, suggest that William's phone was almost certainly a target. That the same private investigators working across multiple Fleet Street titles, serving the same commercial appetite for royal intimacy, did not make a careful editorial distinction between the heir to the throne and his younger brother. That the surveillance was not selective, that it was comprehensive. If William was hacked and the weight of evidence produced across multiple legal proceedings makes this, at minimum, highly probable, then the British monarchy's most future-facing asset, the man who will define the institution for the next half-century and beyond, was systematically surveilled by an industry that simultaneously maintained a carefully choreographed, mutually beneficial relationship with the palace. An industry that was, at the same moment it was intercepting royal voicemails, attending palace garden parties, being granted royal access, publishing the photographs and the approved stories that the palace communications team fed to them as part of the ongoing transaction of institutional image management. Think about the shape of that arrangement. Think about what it means. The same editors who are publishing stories built on hacked royal phone calls were also the editors who would receive a carefully worded call from a palace communications advisor when the institution needed a sympathetic front page. The same newspapers that were stealing private royal conversations were also the newspapers whose proprietors were welcomed into the highest levels of British public life. The relationship was not adversarial. It was codependent. And the hacking did not break that codependence. It was, in a deeply disturbing way, an expression of it. Which brings us to the question that sits at the absolute heart of this story. The question that Harry has asked. The question that the legal proceedings of 2023 and 2024 have given documentary weight to. What did the palace know? When did it know it? And why, for years, across multiple news cycles and multiple opportunities to act, did it choose silence over justice? Here is the dimension of this story that goes furthest beyond the tabloid narrative and deepest into the palace's institutional darkness. The phone hacking of royal targets did not happen in a vacuum sealed off from palace awareness. It happened while those targets were surrounded by one of the most sophisticated security and intelligence operations in the world. The Royalty and Specialist Protection Command of the Metropolitan Police, the unit whose entire professional purpose is the physical and reputational protection of senior members of the royal family, operates in the same institutional environment where phone hacking was occurring. These are not separate worlds. They are the same world, the same city, the same networks, the same conversations. Senior palace courtiers, the private secretaries, the communications advisors, the household officials who manage every dimension of royal life down to the smallest detail, were in daily professional contact with an institution, the British press, that was simultaneously conducting a criminal surveillance operation against the people those courtiers were paid to protect. These are intelligent people. They are experienced people. They are people with access to legal advice, to intelligence briefings, to the informal information networks that operate at the highest levels of British institutional life. The idea that none of them knew that the hacking of royal phones remained a complete mystery to the people whose job it was to protect the royals strains credibility to a point that becomes very difficult to sustain with a straight face. Harry has said in his memoir, in his legal submissions, in public interviews, that he believes palace officials were aware of the hacking and chose, deliberately, to do nothing. That a calculation was made at a senior institutional level. That confronting the press over hacking would damage the carefully managed, strategically essential relationship between the palace and Fleet Street. That protecting that relationship, the relationship that kept the coverage manageable, that ensured the approved stories got the prominent placement, that maintained the careful balance of access and approval that the modern monarchy depends upon, was deemed more important than protecting the princes. More important than the law. More important than justice. This is an extraordinary allegation. It implicates not journalists, not editors, not the private investigators working the grey markets of tabloid journalism. It implicates the palace itself, the institution, the people whose entire professional identity, whose entire public purpose rests on serving and protecting the crown. And Harry is not making this allegation from a position of ignorance. He was inside the institution. He saw how it operated. He knows the calculations that get made in those conversations, in those offices, between those advisors. He is not speculating about an institution he observed from the outside. He is describing one he lived inside for decades. And here is why this matters so profoundly in 2024 and in the years ahead. Because if Harry's allegation is true, if the palace knew and chose silence, then the decision to suppress that knowledge was made by people who served under the late Queen, under Charles, by advisors who may still be operating inside the royal machinery today. The institutional culture that made that decision, that prioritized press relationship management over the protection of its own members from criminal activity, did not evaporate. Institutional cultures do not evaporate. They persist, they adapt. They find new language and new justifications. But the underlying logic remains. William is inheriting an institution that may have knowingly, calculatedly, allowed criminal surveillance of its own members for the sake of maintaining press relationships that were commercially and politically useful to the palace. And William, whose own private conversations were almost certainly among those intercepted, whose own most vulnerable moments were almost certainly part of the commercial transaction being conducted between the newspapers and their investigators, must now decide what to do with that knowledge. He must decide what kind of king he intends to be, and he must decide it in the full awareness that his brother already made his choice, and that his brother's choice cost him everything. William can continue the palace's traditional posture, manage silence, institutional self-protection, the long game of never fully acknowledging what happened, never demanding the full accountability that justice would require. He can take the view that the palace's survival as an institution depends on its ability to draw lines and move past them, on its refusal to allow the full examination of its own failures. He can decide, as so many before him have decided, that the monarchy's relationship with the British press is simply too important, too structurally necessary to the institution's continued relevance, to be sacrificed on the altar of the truth. Or he can do what Harry did. He can use the full weight of his position, the position of the future king, the position of a man the press cannot simply dismiss and destroy the way it dismissed and destroyed Harry, to demand the complete truth. To insist that the palace's own role in the hacking years be examined with the same rigor that was applied to the newsrooms. To refuse the comfortable amnesia that powerful institutions rely upon to survive their own worst choices. Nobody inside the palace who understands how the institution operates, how its calculations are made, what it prioritizes above all else, believes William will choose the second path. The institutional gravity is simply too powerful. The costs are too high. The risk of what a full examination might reveal is too great. The palace will manage this, as it has managed every crisis, with patience and strategic silence and the quiet application of time. But nobody inside the palace is fully comfortable with what the first path requires William to permanently, consciously, deliberately look away from. And that discomfort, that small, persistent, unresolvable tension between institutional self-preservation and the undeniable weight of the truth, is what the hacking verdicts have permanently embedded inside the monarchy. Not as a scandal that can be managed, as a question that cannot be fully answered and cannot be fully ignored. The phone hacking story, at its deepest and most honest level, is not about Harry. It is not about Rupert Murdoch. It is not even about the criminal behaviour of private investigators working the grey markets of British tabloid journalism. It is about a system. A system in which the British press and the British monarchy needed each other so completely, were so fundamentally, structurally codependent in their mutual interest in controlling the public narrative about the royal family, that the boundaries between symbiosis and corruption dissolved over decades, without anyone in a position of power choosing to notice, or choosing to care. The press needed royal access, royal photographs, royal drama, royal intimacy. It needed the monarchy to feed the insatiable commercial appetite of a British public that has consumed royal content since the first illustrated newspaper ran a sketch of a royal occasion and discovered that nothing sells quite like the promise of access to lives lived in palaces. The palace needed the press to project the image of the institution, the grandeur, the tradition, the continued relevance of a hereditary monarchy in a modern democratic society that, if it ever stopped to ask the question clearly and honestly, might struggle to provide a completely satisfying answer for why it still exists in its current form. They were locked together, in mutual dependence, in mutual benefit. And when the press crossed into criminality to feed that appetite, when the investigators were hired and the voicemails were intercepted, and the stolen information was packaged into front-page stories, and the palace looked away to protect that relationship, the institution made itself complicit in the crime. Not legally, not in a way that will produce criminal charges against palace officials or require anyone to sit in the dock of a British criminal court, but morally, institutionally, in the way that history records the choices made by powerful people when the cost of doing the right thing is simply too high, when the right thing threatens the structure that keeps them in the positions of power from which they make their calculations. Harry paid the cost of confronting it. He paid with his place in the institution. He paid with his relationship with his family. He paid with his public reputation inside Britain, where the press he was suing had decades of goodwill and institutional connections to deploy against him. He paid with years of his life, pursuing legal proceedings through a system that had every structural reason to make those proceedings as difficult, as expensive, and as personally damaging as possible. He paid for the truth. And he got it. In a courtroom, on the record, in rulings that cannot be appealed away or managed into silence. William will inherit the silence. He will inherit an institution that has learned, over this extraordinary decade of legal proceedings, that Harry's determination was stronger than its ability to hold the line. That the evidence is now in the public domain. That the paper trail exists. That the questions will not go away, regardless of how many times the palace declines to answer them. And William will have to decide, probably not once but repeatedly over a reign that may last decades, how he relates to the truth that his brother paid so much to establish. And the monarchy that emerges from this era, the monarchy that Prince George will eventually inherit from William, the monarchy that will carry this period in its institutional history the way it carries every period, will carry this story in its foundations, in its structural assumptions, in the unspoken understanding of what it chose to know and what it chose not to know, what it chose to do and what it chose to leave undone, whether it acknowledges that or not, whether the history books that are written in 50 years are permitted to say it clearly or are required to couch it in the careful language of institutional deference. Because the British establishment is extraordinarily good at burying its own history, at managing the narrative, at ensuring that the version of events that reflects most favorably on the institutions of power is the version that persists. But it is not perfect, and sometimes, not often, but sometimes, one person with enough determination and enough resources and enough righteous fury refuses to let the burial happen, refuses to let the line be drawn, refuses to accept the managed resolution and move on and be grateful for the settlement and stay quiet. Sometimes, one person drags the evidence into the light and makes it impossible to pretend it isn't there. Harry did that. Whatever you think of him, whatever your view of his decisions, his interviews, his memoir, his departure from royal life, he did that. He took the evidence to court. He made the palace and the press account for what they had done, in a forum where the truth has legal standing, and the establishment's preference for convenient amnesia carries no weight whatsoever. And the rulings that resulted from that decision are now part of the public record. Permanent. Unmanageable. There. The question I want you to take into the comments below, because I genuinely want to hear your thoughts on this, is the following. Should there be a full, independent public inquiry, a new Leveson with genuine powers of compulsion and a genuine mandate to examine everything, including the palace's knowledge and the palace's choices into what the British establishment knew about phone hacking and when? Or has the British establishment's decades-long perfection of the art of managing its own scandals made that kind of genuine, structural accountability permanently, constitutionally impossible in this country? Tell me what you think. I read every comment. This is a conversation, not a broadcast, and your perspective on this matters. If this is the depth of analysis and the quality of storytelling you want more of, then subscribe right now and hit the notification bell, because we are moving through 20 topics, and every single one of them goes to places the mainstream royal commentary refuses to go. Because topic 10 is next. And topic 10 is the one that explains how Harry was outmaneuvered from the very beginning, before he even knew the game had started. How decisions were made by people inside the institution that shaped the trajectory of everything that followed. How the palace, which presents itself as a reactive institution simply managing the crises that come its way, was in this case far more deliberate, far more strategic, and far more ruthless than the official story has ever acknowledged. We are not finished. We are just getting started. Stay with me.